What is up, y'all? So, I finished up that chessboard and gave it away, and the recipient seemed to really enjoy it. And now her birthday's coming up, and she needs some chess pieces to go with that board. So I picked up some pieces of walnut and some pieces of maple for chess pieces. So we're gonna turn those into some chess pieces. I got the idea from another person on YouTube. I really like their design for their chess pieces, so that's kind of the design I went with. And then I also decided to make a nice box to go along with it. Nice felted box to store the pieces in. So, without further ado, let's get into it. I don't have a ton of footage of the first few steps here, so on to the table saw.
So, first and foremost, I want to start by saying I did not come up with the design for these chess pieces. That credit goes to a YouTuber by the name of Chris Salomon, and I'll try to put a link right up here in the corner for the video I watched of his. And yeah, that's where I got most of the idea for all of these. Dimensions are slightly different, and the only piece that I really changed from his design was the bishops, just because I kind of wasn't a huge fan of how his looked, and I wanted to try something a little different. But right here I'm just making the pawns, and yeah, it's kind of boring, so I'm speeding up and cutting out some of these, because, well, no reason to watch me cut 16 of the exact same pieces. But that's what's happening here. So the setup I used here for the knights is kind of janky. I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to go about it, so the way I ended up doing it, I wasn't a huge fan of. There has to be a better way with what I had. But yeah, this is how I did the knights, and then I went through and set the blade to cut up a notch to kind of give a shape to the nose of the horse. And because I'd made so many previous mistakes, here you see me testing this out on a piece of scrap, because I was really tired of cutting out more of these pieces. So I tested it out on a piece of scrap, and then I set it up for the actual pieces. At first I wasn't super stoked how little of a cutout there was for the notch on these knights, so I went back through and set it a hair further in, and just took another pass at it and about doubled the width of that cut. So next up, I was cutting out the kings, and I mean, this one was pretty simple for the main detail on it. I just had to set the saw blade at a 45-degree angle and then take a pass at it from each side, and it left you with a nice crown shape on the top. And all in all, it turned out pretty good. I was pretty happy with how these pieces ended up. Here you can see me cutting out the queens. These were also pretty simple. It was essentially the same setup as the kings, just reversed. So just cut that up, cut a kind of a taper on the top, and yeah, these are pretty simple. So the next piece up on the docket was the bishops, and I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to do these, so I kind of messed around a little bit with a few pieces, and I came up with kind of this rough design, and I'm pretty happy with it. So I just set the saw at a 45-degree angle and took a pass at all sides, and then after that I went through and put the blade back at 90 degrees and just chopped off that undercut, which you'll see in a second here. So here you can see me cutting in the taper on the top of the bishops, just to give it a more rounded look on the top and kind of smooth it out for the next step. Alright, so this is the last step I was doing on the bishops. I was setting up the saw blade to roughly a 30-degree angle to cut that sort of iconic little angled slice in the bishops, and it turned out pretty good. I was pretty happy with how the cut ended up. So, as you might have guessed, these are going to be the rooks, and I'm setting it up to cut the kind of cross shape in the top. I mean, these were pretty simple, and these were the last main piece I had to cut before I started adding more details to the rest. As you might see, I'm also going through and I'm cutting each of these multiple times, spinning it essentially a full 360 for cuts. This is just because I wasn't positive that I had it set up perfectly centered, so this would just make sure that the cuts would end up center no matter what. So now I'm just going through and adding a little more detail. The original video I had watched and got the idea of, and inspiration for these four didn't exactly specify kind of where he was putting them, these extra little cuts in relation to, the rest of the features on the pieces. So I kind of just did it, sort of however, and just in a way that I thought looked good. So that's kind of how it went, and I think they turned out pretty good. And these little extra cuts definitely make them quite a bit more, fancy than just having the top. Definitely looks better with these cuts. So after getting all of these pieces cut and taken care of on the table saw, it was time for the most exciting part of any project, sanding. I'd started out by hand sanding these, and that took quite a while. The main thing is I went through with some really small files and kind of cleaned out some of the grooves and evened up some things that were not quite perfect. After that, I kind of just caved in and took it over to the belt sander. The finish wasn't going to be as good on the belt sander, but it was a heck of a lot better than hand sanding. So I didn't end up putting the other video of the first coat in here. This is actually the second coat going on these. The first coat got sucked right in, and it didn't really look like it did much, so I kind of just cut that whole video out, and here's the second coat. It went on pretty well. I thinned the shellac that I was using way down, so it's pretty thin. It ran right off for the most part. A decent bit got soaked in, but it was thin enough that it wasn't going to give any runs or any major brush strokes, so it went pretty smoothly. All in all, I was pretty happy with it. I gave it a light sand after this, and then that was about it. So the next step for these chest pieces was putting felt on the bottom. It was a pretty simple process. I essentially just put some spray adhesive onto the felt, and then I stuck these on times 16 pieces. So here you can see I'm going through and just trimming down the excess felt, just so there's not as much laying around. After that, I threw a box of drill bits on top of it to weigh it down and make sure they got a nice good glue up. So after they dried for a little bit, I went and cut them into individual pieces, and then went through and individually trimmed them down and got the felt nice and flush to the chest pieces, and it turned out pretty good. I was pretty happy with how the felt looked. It wasn't sticking out or anything terribly noticeably once I was finished cutting them down, so I was pretty happy with it. So yeah, here's just a bunch of me cutting felt. Well, that's it. That's the end of the video. As I'm editing this, it's already pretty long, just the chest pieces alone, so I'll be throwing up part 2 to this with the actual box that these will be stored in. Give it its own video, so it's not a half-hour long video just for this project, but thanks for watching, and yeah.